I think there's a reason for it. Whether it's religious or whether it's global warming or whether it's something out there telling us we need to change what we're doing.
The historic flooding that took place during the summer of 2022 in East Kentucky and Appalachia not only drew attention to the devastating realities of increasingly extreme weather events, but to the failings of weather prediction technology and broadband infrastructure in rural Kentucky, failings that ultimately left those rural communities ill-prepared for the floods.
Sirens, floods.
The region is no stranger to flooding disasters. The Jackson Forecast Office was established by the National Weather Service 2 years after the deadly East Kentucky flood of 1977. A history of man-made topography changes through strip mining and logging have contributed to the soil's inability to hold water. So flooding is rarely out of the question when rain outstays its welcome.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we try to use trained spotters. Some of that information was coming in. I think we had some social media information coming in. Also, we rely heavily on our partners at WYMT or places like that. So we were watching their news broadcast as well and seeing what information they were gathering as well. I'm sure communications and infrastructure was probably an issue. You think about it. You have a normal night, a dispatcher, there's probably one dispatcher in a county, maybe two, I don't know. But there's probably not enough dispatchers for the amount of information that's now flooding in to a lot of these places. So, and then a lot of the places, I know the next morning as I came into Jackson, I had no cell service coming into Jackson, and so the infrastructure was probably, but I can't speak to exactly, what infrastructure was down, but I know it would be a lot to handle for dispatchers and emergency managers at that point.
In this instance, precipitation fell July 25th through the 30th, with some locations receiving up to 16 inches of rain. Rapid rainfall peaked overnight on July 27th into early morning the next day. Meteorologists base their weather predictions on past data. Last year's flood was outside of that scope entirely.
Was there anything that really indicated with good confidence that we were going to see this? It just wasn't there, Now the St. Louis flood, kind of the same system about a day before. If you looked at some of the model data from that, there was more of an increasing signal for potentially more extreme event. But when you looked at Eastern Kentucky, it just wasn't there.
Meteorologists in Jackson knew that heavy rainfall made the environment susceptible to flooding. They just didn't know it could happen to the extent it did. Current numerical weather prediction models weren't engineered to account for such rare events like a 1,000-year flood, a flood that has a 1 in 1,000 chance of occurring annually. Under this single model, forecasters rely on past and current observational data taken from weather balloons, satellites, buoys, and aircrafts from major airports, most of which tend to be deployed in more populated or urban areas.
Aircrafts provide most valuable data because they can also measure the vertical profile of all the atmosphere while they're flying. And they provide much more valuable data than any other instrument on ground or in the space.
Out of our country's 123 forecast offices, only 17% are in rural areas. And with less continuous observational data for places like Appalachia and Eastern Kentucky, weather models have less to work with. This can lead to less accurate weather forecasts in rural areas.
This is also called, ethics of observations. Are we ethically distributing the observation network equally across all areas? Urban areas are more observed than the rural areas, and the networking of these observations can have some I would say unintended influence on how the models perceive situation.
A newer weather model without baked-in urban bias can make things very different for meteorologists in their predictions, but would that even matter if rural broadband can't keep up? A report by the Kentucky Department of Public Health conducted 387 interviews across households in FEMA disaster zones, including the Kentucky River District, Letcher, Knott, Perry, and Owsley, and its 4 surrounding counties, Floyd, Pike, Breathitt, and Clay. Researchers also interviewed those who have been displaced and are now living in shelter sites.
Another important consideration, too, is the broadband access that people are limited with in some of these areas. And so we found that many households did not have a working internet or cellular service. And so in order to receive communication, you need access to receive communication.
Out of those assessed, 13.8% of residents in the Kentucky River District and 7.3% of those living in outlying counties received no flood warning at all.
And you said the service is pretty good in this area usually?
Well, usually it was, but like I said, Appalachian Wireless was one of the first things to go out. Put this down. From the plays, and I went to New Orleans, and I had to have a basket, and that's the only one I could afford, and that was $15. Our phones went out about 1 a.m, and that included cell phones. But prior to that, I did not receive any text. And people were telling me I had to turn my phone off because I got so many texts about the flood that was coming. And I'm like, not a soul, not one emergency outlet, no one texted me. So I just slept through it. Nobody woke me up. I slept through it, and I didn't know my son was desperately trying to get in touch with me. About 5 o'clock in the morning, I woke up, and I put my foot off the bed, and I felt water.
According to the report, even though most households in the assessment sites had no issue receiving flood warnings, internet and cell service were methods of communication that people had the most trouble accessing.
Now, this one time, it did go all night, the last time in July. But if you don't have signal or if your phone's dead, how are you getting those?
Tiffany Clare, along with her 2 children, lives in Owsley County and is a survivor of 2 flooding events. She received no warning during the March 2021 flood, and despite receiving warnings during last year's flood, she's uncertain of their effectiveness.
Most people now are moving away from local news networks. They're moving away from satellite that offers that, and they're moving towards Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, this or that, okay? There's no warning system in place for that. I mean, there's just not. So people aren't getting the warnings they should get.
But efforts to improve both rural weather prediction and broadband access are underway.
So the result of it would be, in the next couple of years, we will see, I would say, a revolutionary change in how we are going to predict the short-range weather and the extremes associated with that in a much more skillful way.
According to National Weather Service officials, the United Forecast System is set to launch in 2024. It will be comprised of 10 models that will help to fill the gap between rural and urban weather observation. These models will also have an expanded computing and statistical capacity, which will help them account for weather extremes more accurately.
And we are preparing all our forecast offices to learn about the new system. We are training them, providing the data. It's going to be monumental.
In the case of broadband, the report by the Kentucky Department of Public Health recommends the use of social media to bolster emergency communications.
Communicate through different sources of messaging is something that we talk about in the report. For example, increasing social media use, which connects to having access to internet and cell service. But social media is a platform that's becoming increasingly available and used, and this can proliferate to word of mouth.
Fortunately, better broadband is in the works. Last summer, over $200 million was allocated in Kentucky for improvements in broadband. Last December, Governor Andy Beshear announced that Kentucky had been awarded a $5.8 million Internet for All federal grant, intended to bolster the state's continued effort to close the broadband gap, especially in Kentucky's underserved communities.
Today, I'm pleased to announce Kentucky has been chosen to receive a $5.8 million Internet for All planning grant funded through the Federal Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, or BEAD program. It's going to help us better identify communities with no high-speed internet access or pinpoint locations that are underserved. This comes after we were able to make the largest public sector investment in internet in the Commonwealth's history, which will hook up 34,000 homes for the first time.
Since then, Kentucky has been awarded an additional $182 million under the American Rescue Plan that will further fund its Better Internet grant program. As extreme weather events become more common, weather prediction technologies combined with better broadband for rural communities won't save properties. The infrastructure required for that is a different conversation entirely.
And like I said, the home that we previously lived in was a 75-year-old house. My grandfather built it with his bare hands.
But these solutions may help save time and lives.
I mean, I lost things. People lost family.
I don't know that from a governmental level it can be prevented. I mean, Mother Nature's Mother Nature. But I think that in the aftermath, we need to take care of our own. We, as a government, we need to help the ones that need the help. And not just for when the catastrophe happens.